Daniels has authored more than 30 collections of poetry, 7 collections of fiction, and 1 collection of essays. He has also edited or co-edited 6 anthologies, most recently Respect, The Poetry of Detroit Music. His books have won 4 Michigan Notable Book Awards, the Brittingham Prize in Poetry, the Blue Lynx Prize for Poetry, the Tillie Olsen Creative Writing Award, and the Milton Kessler Award, among others. We'll post a more complete biography in our show notes, and you can also find it on the MSU Press website page for his latest book, Late Invocation for Magic. Welcome back, Jim.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Since we last talked in 2021, you've published 4 collections of poetry, including the one we're here to talk about today, Late Invocation for Magic. What's your secret? How do you produce such a volume of work?
Well, I'm semi-retired now, so I have more time, and that's good. So I've always, writing is something I will always do, and it's kind of coincidental that some of the books came out so close together, and a couple of them were chapbooks, so they were smaller collections. And the Late Invocation for Magic is a new and selected poem, so I was actually drawing from previous books for a lot of those poems. So the new section is, substantial in terms of poems that hadn't been published in books before. But I have this sort of work ethic that I think comes from coming from a family of hard workers, and so I feel I get guilty if I'm not writing and reading, and it's an obsession. It's one of those more positive obsessions than others. So it continues to be a really emotional outlet for me as well, to try and figure out what's going on.
Late Invocation for Magic is a new collection of poems, or a new compilation, I guess, of poems from other books. You've also done a similar project in 2003, Show and Tell. So what's different about putting together this book compared to a collection of all new works? Does your creative process change?
It does. And talking about obsession, one of the things I noticed when I was going through the previous books is that I tend to come back to certain subjects over and over again. So it was interesting to look at how the poems have evolved on certain subjects over time. It's not always that you cover a subject in one poem, because, the emotions return in various ways. And as my life changes, my perspective on some of those events tends to change as well. With Show and Tell, the first new and selected poems, it was, I think, dealing with some of the poems were, I was young when I started publishing, and so some of the poems I dismissed because they were a little raw and unrefined. And I got to the point where I started rewriting. I said, uh-oh, I can't rewrite all those poems to represent who I am now. I better just leave them alone and just pick the ones that I think are good the way they are. So that was a kind of learning experience that I took into this new collection. And I published with a wide range of publishers, and some of the books had been limited editions or out of print by now. And I just felt like I wanted to represent what I've been doing over the last, I guess 23 years now, in terms of the work that I want to, that I still feel strongest about, that I still want to read aloud and share with an audience of readers.
Thinking back to your early days, which you do a lot of in some of your poetry, when you were young, growing up in Warren and working at a factory yourself and going to university, when or how did it occur to you that you might become a poet and a professor?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll try and give you one version that's relatively brief, but I went to remedial speech class from kindergarten through 8th grade. which is a long time to go to remedial speech class, but for whatever reason, I slurred my words and I just couldn't figure out how to get my tongue to make the sounds. And so all the sibilant sounds, S, H, C, H, J, Z, they were giving me trouble. So the way it goes with kids is they look for a weakness and they'll tease you about whatever weakness they find because it's part of being a kid, I guess. But I developed a habit of not speaking when I wasn't confident or comfortable in the surroundings. Like at home with my family and my best friends in the neighborhood, I I was, not self-conscious about it, but in school and other public settings, I tended to be pretty reserved and holding back. And I ended up kind of writing my thoughts and feelings, things I wish I would have said, but didn't say during the day. Writing them out was a release for me and kind of a habit I developed. And then in high school, a history teacher, actually, Dennis McCarthy. I had written a kind of creative response to a film we saw about the fall of the Roman Empire. I remember it very clearly. And I played with this whole idea of, what are our contemporary bread and circuses, which, I could do today as well. Yeah, but he saw a spark of something in there. And he said, this is really interesting. If you ever write anything else, like this, feel free to show it to me. And I I had already been writing my thoughts down, and so I started bringing in some of that, and he just gave me a lot of encouragement. But eventually, he took me over to an English teacher who looked at some of the things I was writing, and he said, "Oh, you're writing poetry," and uh, I didn't like poetry, so I didn't know what to make of that because it was intimidating. It was kind of taught often with the crossword puzzle approach, which is kind of the teacher has the answer key in terms of what this poem is about, and you got to kind of guess and get the right answer, which was an intellectual thing that took out the whole emotional thing that actually drew me to poetry once I started reading more accessible contemporary stuff. Not that the older things weren't good, but I just wasn't trained to really find the emotion in them and interpret the more complex language they were using or more archaic language. And, I was off to the races from there.
That's amazing. And during that time, as you were growing up and formatting this idea, many people in history now view that time in Warren as the golden years of the auto industry. But you paint a more complicated picture with a lot of tension. For example, the title poem, Late Invocation from Magic, explores the tension between fairy tale ideas and real life dangers. So, what are you trying to capture when you write about that time?
Well, I don't have a grand thesis in mind, but you're right. I think I'm going for a certain kind of complexity beneath the surface. And one of the tensions and challenges really was that when you're working in the auto factory, at least when I was there was a tension between, so if you were doing your job correctly and efficiently, you were essentially functioning as a machine, very robotic, repetitious work. And in our neighborhood, all the houses were identical as well. So there was this anonymity both at work and at home. So the idea of how to assert yourself as an individual in the midst of all this homogenous atmosphere at work and at home, I think was something that I was really trying to capture. And I was finding once I, really started reading a lot more literature that the lives of the people I knew the most and care about the most really weren't showing up, particularly in the poetry that I was reading, or showing up enough, or sometimes from the outside in. a Canadian poet, Tom Wayman, has written about this quite a bit in terms of the insider perspective of somebody who has actually done the work versus somebody who's looking in from the outside in terms of, I mean, obviously, whatever you're writing about, you have to create authenticity, whether you've done something or not. There's obviously also a creative component in terms of creating the authority to write about things. So it's a complicated thing, but that's kind of one of the things I focused on, and it continues to be something that I focus on. For example, in Pittsburgh and in other places, there tends to be a significant problem with the homeless community, and the government doesn't always know how to handle it in a humane way. And so, where I live in Pittsburgh now, it's actually in the neighborhood where the old steel mills used to be on the south side. So there's also that sort of working class sensibility here that I feel comfortable with. But along the river, the mills were all along the Monongahela River. That's where a lot of the homeless community lived. And so I would walk around down there by the river. I walked down there this morning, and they're another kind of community that gets stereotyped and neglected sometimes. So I continue. So I've written some things about those kind of encounters. So that's continued to be something that I've been interested in. And uh, one of the things that I wanted to touch on, to come back to the previous question also, was how I ended up teaching and how I ended up thinking that was a possibility, really. So I went to Alma College in the middle of Michigan, and it was smaller than the high school I went to, and it was a very different environment. But I went there because I met a, a couple of the professors there at this high school writing thing. Uh, and one of the things that actually happened is that I was motivated to go to college, which because by the time I got out of high school, I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I felt like, hey, I got to go to college if I'm going to be a writer. Because up until that point, my grades improved significantly once I said, oh, I got to go to college. And I got in enough of the college prep classes at the end. I remember my senior year, I had to take a science course, and I took chemistry, and I was in there with all these sophomores because that was a sophomore level advanced course. And then, so I managed to get into Alma, and then in Alma was a place that gave me the sense that, hey, it's not crazy that I could actually, teach and make a living doing that. And then I really connected to the idea of furthering my education. Went to grad school in Bowling Green, Ohio, and I I started publishing work pretty early on because of the encouragement of some of my professors at Alma. Jim Tipton was one. And then I was lucky to get this job at Carnegie Mellon University here in Pittsburgh. And I was lucky and I knew it. So I held on to that job until I retired a few years ago. But I still like teaching and connecting with young writers. And it's really inspiring to me. At Elm, I teach all ages, but still the idea of people getting it, of understanding and having that energy and enthusiasm is something that, to be honest with, I continue to feed off of because I think after a certain point, sometimes writers can get cynical or repetitious. And I'm conscious of trying not, of keeping it fresh and keeping the energy alive. So it ended up being a great thing for me.
That's excellent. So, what a great story. We do want to go back to maybe some of your poems about fatherhood and life in Pittsburgh, the later part of your life.
Yeah.
Um, in those poems, you do kind of have the same kind of tension that you express in the poems about your youth and childhood, but it's a little bit different of a distance. that you take on it. Of course, you're older and you're playing a different role in life, but do you feel maybe childhood experiences and youthful experiences resonate differently with people? Are they maybe more present in some ways?
Oh, that's a good question too. I think that it connects kind of to what I was just saying in terms of my what I get from my students. I also got that from my children as well. That simple joy of discovering the world, new things, new words, new experiences, and the excitement of young children entering the world, and also the challenges of being a parent too, in terms of figuring out, you want to do the right thing, but it's hard to know what the right thing is in terms of giving the kids space, particularly when they enter the teen years. And I was such a rebellious teenager myself that my kids luckily did not do, as far as I know, nearly half as much of the crazy things I did when I was a teenager.
That's awesome, as long as we don't know, I guess. So after writing over 30 books, how do you know when a poem or story is finished or when a collection's complete? Is it when your editor stops you or when you stop yourself? How do you figure that out?
Well, that's an ongoing challenge with no easy answer, but uh, I spend a lot of time revising. So if you could see the desktop of my computer now, there are all these different folders in terms of where levels are at, where the work is at. So I have a folder called Ideas for poems and writing, where I just get an idea and I don't have time to develop it or explore it, but I don't want to lose it. I just put the ideas in there. And then I have another folder of the poems that are in progress, and then another folder of the poems I think that are ready to submit somewhere. Now, I tend not to be a real patient person, so this is continuing to be a challenge for me because sometimes I get overly excited about a piece and think it's done when I really do. If I come back in another month or so, I'm going to see things that need to be done. I mean, a lot of my revision process ends, particularly in poetry, ends up being a lot of tightening up because a lot of my poems are narrative, they're storytelling. And to make them poems, I have to pay attention to compression. I mean, that's one of the definitions of a poem is compressed, intense language. And obviously, the sound of voices in poetry are part of what makes things poetry, not prose. So in the revision process, I do try to pay more attention to shaping the poem in terms of line breaks and rhythm and sound devices. And then sometimes I'm still wrong. And when I was putting together the new and selected with the new poems, I wanted them to not to be too new because with my students, like they'd be applying to graduate school because at Carnegie Mellon, I taught mostly undergrads. And, they just have to send in a portfolio of their writing. And occasionally some student would say, well, I just wrote this poem last week and I really liked it, so I included it in my portfolio. And I go, ah, let me look at that. Yeah, you needed to let it rest. It's pretty raw right now. But there's that emotional release of getting things down that sometimes you mistake for, oh, it's done. It's done because you got it down on paper, but you want an audience for it, and you have to think about that. Well, if somebody's reading this, are they going to be able to understand what the heck I'm talking about? And I think about that too a lot in revision. Obviously, it's totally clear to me, but other people don't have the background and context. And you have to think about how to get that in without just having it be all this backstory. And that's one of the fun things about putting a manuscript together is the ordering the poems so that you can build a kind of larger narrative. Some people talk about the first poem in a book being like the first line of a poem, and the last line of the last poem in a book being like the last line of a poem. And, I really think about poems in that way. That's why I have to print them out and spread them out on a big table to really think about the order, because I can't do it visually on a computer screen. I just can't.
I think it's awesome that you've set up sort of a factory system for your poetry stages, line 1, line 2, and line 3. That's that's very cool. So, reviewers have described you as a blue-collar poet. Are there any younger poets writing about working class life that you like to read and maybe would recommend?
Oh yeah, yeah. And what's exciting is a lot of younger writers will ask me to write the blurbs for them and things like that that I connect to. There's a poet from the Detroit area named Andrew Collard who just published his second book. And I came across his first book in a bookstore in the Detroit area when I was doing a reading in town, and I just picked it up randomly, and I said, "Wow, this guy's really got something going." And I found him online and said, "Hey, this is great stuff." And then he sent me his second manuscript that just came out from Wayne State University Press, and there's R.E. Dereen, Dereen, is a fiction writer from Michigan, and his work is he's a fiction writer, but in short stories, but his work is pretty exciting. And you know, there's a new generation of writers coming up with working class concerns and focuses. Obviously, I've taught for a majority of my adult life, so I come from a working class background of 4 generations really. And I did do the work myself enough to make connections between life at work and life outside of work, because at that point, it was most of the fathers in the neighborhood were working in the auto industry, and I would see them out of work. And then when I started working in the same factory my father worked at, I would start to make connections between, oh, this work, because it was affecting me in interesting ways, because particularly working a lot of overtime, you don't really catch your breath, and just the difficulty of the work was really intensified. And in terms of how people would relax or unwind when they were at home when I'd see them. I mean, my father, who died in January, age 97. I mean, we used to talk. He worked for Ford too, as I said, and he would often talk about things we did while we were growing up, and things that were mentioned earlier, not always on our best behavior. I have 3 brothers and a sister, and he'd say, "Where was I when all this was happening?" And because he never knew about some of these things. But that was a rhetorical question because we knew he was at work. I have a poem in the late invocation for magic called "My Father Worked 800 Hours of Overtime," because he kept track, and one year he worked 800 hours. So that's 20 extra 40-hour weeks that he worked that year. That's a heck of a lot of overtime. And he was in a position, I mean, at the time we kind of resented him not being around, but later we understood, hey, he had 5 kids at home. It's not like he could just up and quit. He had a sizable family to support. And so it's not like he had a choice in terms of how much time he spent with us.
So what are you working on now? What's new? What's coming up the pipe?
Well, that's an interesting question. I have been writing more essays lately to follow up on An Ignorance of Trees by Cornerstone Press was my book of essays that came out actually less than a year ago, last August. And a lot of that it covers similar subject matter, but from a different perspective. I mean, it's nonfiction, so I really have to be true. You have to take away what I have in poetry and fiction, which is the what if factor. Oh, well, wouldn't it be interesting to think about what if this happened or what if that happened? In nonfiction, you deal with, hey, what happened? So that's an interesting restriction. There's always been autobiographical elements to my work, but this kind of takes that to another level. So I have been continuing to spread it out between fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And it's kind of fun because if I'm stuck in one genre, then I kind of switch to another genre. So another folder I have is fiction and nonfiction in progress versus poetry in progress. And I was just proofreading an essay that will be coming out in Plowshares magazine in the fall. And it deals with going to a concert at Pine Knob, which in the Detroit area is a big outdoor music venue during the summer, and connecting a lot of things to the neighborhood. But one of the things I've been exploring, there was an absence of a connection to the natural world in my upbringing. So, an ignorance of trees comes from the idea that I was reading this book, The Overstory by Richard Powers, that I think won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a big novel. And one of the tenets of this book is trees talk to each other through their roots. And I was thinking, hell, I don't even know the names of any trees. So we grew up, there were two kind of trees. There were like Christmas trees or, pine trees you easily recognize. And then there were all the other trees that had leaves on them. And so I knew the names of all the cars, right? But there were very few green spaces in our neighborhood because these neighborhoods went up around the auto factories without any thought to preserving any kind of natural thing. They were building houses like assembly line work. And so I've been exploring the sense of the disconnection and maybe how that affected us, in addition to how the work affected us, and the sense of separation from the natural world. In Michigan, there's this expression, or maybe it's a fact, that if you live in Michigan, you're never more than 6 miles from a body of water. And so I started thinking about, well, where was our body of water? you know, and I couldn't actually find one. I don't know how they define body of water, but I couldn't find one. It could have been the Detroit River, but that was maybe 10 miles away or something like that. So just thinking about the connections between an urban environment versus the whole notion that in Michigan, of the dream of having a place up north or going up north is this mythological aspect, and that includes going to Canada as well. And my father would take us camping, where we'd cross over the bridge, and there were some wonderful provincial parks that we would camp at that were actually, some of them were really a lot more beautiful than some of the Michigan state parks.
Well, I hear you, Jim. I grew up in Shiawassee County, and unless you count a gravel pit, I'm pretty sure we were more than 6 miles from a body of water. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, those other lucky Michiganders. So, would you like to read a little bit of Late Invocation Magic for our listeners?
Sure. This is called Tunnel to Canada. And it's a relevant poem because the whole issue with the new bridge not opening, which I won't go into, but it's a beautiful bridge. And so the connections between Michigan and Canada are really strong. I mean, I was doing these readings last week, and we were talking with the audience in these libraries, and I was saying, well, I was talking about, traveling to France, and I said, well, we've all been to Canada, but that doesn't really count as a foreign country because, we feel those connections so closely. And that shows up in this. So there's two epigraphs to this poem, Tunnel to Canada. The first one, the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel connects the cities of Detroit, Michigan and Windsor, Ontario, Canada. It is the second busiest crossing between the United States and Canada, the first being the Ambassador Bridge, which also connects the two cities, which are situated on the Detroit River. And then the second epigraph, so I remember hearing this story when we were growing up. And so I tried to do some research to see if it ever actually happened. And I did find this on some sort of chat group. It's a quote from somebody who said, I seem to recall a dumbass teen that stuck his head out of the car in the winter Detroit tunnel and got decapitated on a pillar. See, and we heard this when we were kids. It said, oh, don't stick your head out in the tunnel. And I don't know if it ever happened, but it was an urban legend. Okay, Tunnel to Canada. I looked forward to crossing the Ambassador Bridge, but ended up in a tunnel to Canada that has no grand name or view. An old girlfriend from out of state thought Tunnel to Canada was the name of a downtown restaurant. I emerged into the light to answer questions at the border after accidentally drifting into the frequent flyer lane. My life has been a series of gentle decapitations, and yet another curious head pops up again and suspicious wonder at survival. Out of the darkness into the light, and already angry men asking questions about me changing lanes. Oh, Canada, I hum in my own anxious tunnel. They have been so nice to me in Canada. I want to end every sentence I write with Canada. I have burned many inelegant bridges, nothing like the bridges to Canada. I want to end every sentence with bridges. I misspelled inelegant so that it looks like intelligent. I have also burned many intelligent bridges with my stupidity matches, waterproof strike anywhere matches. I want to end every sentence with matches. Don't play with matches. I never lit a tennis match. I never played a match made in heaven. I want to end every sentence with heaven. I had a good meal at Tunnel to Canada. It's a nude restaurant, but the novelty is worn off. Clothes are back. The lights are back on. It's turning into a dark restaurant. The meal was all potato chips and poker chips, a special at the casino. It is hard to end many lines with casino, given that Windsor only has one. Finally, Detroit legalized casinos to compete with Windsor's casino. Though for many years I was a dumbass teen, I was never beheaded and continue as a dumbass into my 20s. They finally let me through customs at the end of the tunnel without even searching me. Me, I am still searching. And I'm going to read a little poem that connects to my parents and when they came to visit me when I had a sabbatical and we took our little kids to France because we could because we had the time and my wife could speak some French and we just thought, oh, let's just have an adventure. So my parents had never been abroad, and so it was a big deal when they decided to visit us there. We were there for 4 months. So this is called French omelette. When my parents came to France to visit, they got on the wrong train. We lived in the middle of nowhere, too small for their map. We retrieved them at another station and drove to our small house surrounded by someone else's grapevines. My father, retired from Ford's in Detroit, could not believe how narrow the roads were. Unmarked paths, really, two-way traffic on one lane, requiring small gestures of deference. On leave, I had a small break from marking papers. My mother had raised 5 kids and nursed her tiny mother till she died. All she wanted was a French omelet. Out of season, the small restaurants nearby were closed. I myself did not know what made an omelet French. We grew up with scrambled eggs on special occasions and hard-boiled at Easter. My 2 small children liked sweet brioche bread toasted for breakfast in our dark, stony kitchen. My mother read them bedtime stories. My father built fires in the fireplace. We were all in some version of heaven, though my mother already relied on a cane and wore tinted glasses on a narrowing road to a wheelchair and blindness. She got her omelet in a roadside cafe one sunny February afternoon, warm enough to sit out on a tiny terrace. She refused to be disappointed with their small, modest lives, their ordinary children. She was in France, eating an omelet, so light she had to keep it from floating away with her fork. Just the five of us in the cafe. My father could relax now that she had her omelet. We squinted into the sun with all the time in the world as the clocks briefly paused to grant her that small wish. I keep saying small, even as it grows in memory, looming down from the distant sky years after her passing. I can see that full yellow plate in front of her. She ate it for the rest of her life.
So, Jim Daniels, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It was great. It was a lot of fun, and you had some good questions. And I always like talking about Michigan and Canada and my youth there, which is long gone, but I still it's still in here and in my heart as well.
Thank you. Jim Daniels' latest collection of poetry, Late Invocation for Magic, is available from MSU Press.